So, good evening everybody. In this first presentation, I want to give you our current understanding about obesity in pets. And I'm going to start by showing you two videos. Whilst you're watching these videos, I'd like you to think about the emotions that you are feeling, the emotions that these videos elicit. So we are all veterinary professionals and we're there to help the pets that we serve. But I think it is fair to say that obesity elicits a range of emotions within us and within all of us for that matter. No doubt a lot of those emotions were concern, worry, sadness, because we want to care for our patient, but it's not uncommon also to find something humorous about the topic of obesity. Obesity is a condition like no other. It's one that really does give these unusual emotions, I think it's fair to say. Let's make no mistake, we are actually dealing with a serious condition here. It is in fact something we should consider as a disease. Yet we see other images where veterinary professionals are parading these animals very much like trophies or something to be laughed at. One of the biggest problems facing us as a veterinary profession and how we deal with obesity is this attitude of society and even within ourselves. And I don't think we're going to make any big differences, sadly, in tackling obesity until we start to change our attitudes. Now, we currently understand obesity as a disease in that it meets all of the formal criteria for a disease definition. This is the position that is held by the majority of medical associations throughout the world. And in the last 18 months, I've been part of an initiative to try to get veterinary organizations, again worldwide, to formally endorse obesity as a disease. We've had some success. So in July 2018, the American Veterinary Medical Association agreed that obesity should be defined as a disease. And since then, another 25 associations have also followed suit. Now, the reason for defining obesity as a disease comes from the fact that it is a complex medical disorder. And I'm going to show you that and the evidence for that in the presentation today, but also the fact that it is very difficult to treat. And it is hoped that the definition of obesity, calling it a disease rather than, for example, just a lifestyle problem, will improve the way we manage our pets. So, during this presentation, we're going to start by looking at the causes of obesity. I'm going to take some information from people and also information from pets here. And then we'll turn our attention to the consequences. And this is really what makes it a serious health concern and makes it a disease. And at the end of this presentation, I'm just going to start exploring some of the benefits that successful weight loss will bring. Knowing the consequences, we can actually be reasonably confident that we will actually achieve some success in making our patients feel better and feel happier. So let's look at this first aspect. What causes obesity? And in fact, there are two answers to this. Firstly, there is a simple answer, but secondly, there is a far more complicated underlying answer. The simple answer has everything to do with Star Trek. Now, many of you, like me, might have been Star Trek fans in your youth, or might even be Star Trek fans now. My favourite series was the original episodes, and they starred Captain Kirk, Mr. Spock, but my favourite character of all was this guy, Scotty. If you remember, Scotty was the engineer. He was the man for the crisis. So when Captain Kirk needed something special, he always called upon Scotty. Now, the other thing about Scotty was the fact that he had some excellent phrases, some excellent sayings. And my favourite one of all was this. Apologies, I don't do Scottish accents, but in Scotty's words, you canna change the laws of physics. What he is emphasising here is the fact that we have fundamental laws of physics that underpin everything within the universe. And there is a very important law of physics which is very pertinent to obesity. That is the law of thermodynamics, the first law of thermodynamics, or put another way, the law of conservation of energy. I suspect this is something that you all learnt at school, but as a reminder, the law of conservation of energy dictates that energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only be converted from one form to another. This is best illustrated if we think of a pendulum swinging back and forward. At the top of the swing, the pendulum has no kinetic energy, but it has the most potential energy. And then as it passes back and forward in the swing, it's losing potential energy, but gaining kinetic energy all the time. So energy in this stable system is not being lost, it is simply being converted between forms. Now we can think of the body, the human body, or that of a cat or dog, as a stable system. So within that system, energy will be converted between forms, and energy is stored principally within our adipose tissue. If we add energy to the system, then that will increase what's there. If we use energy up, then it will be converted to other forms, but again will be lost from that system. But overall, the system stays within balance. We add by consuming food, principally our macronutrients, protein, fat, and carbohydrate. Energy is used up by converting to heat in thermogenesis, through metabolic processes, and in movement. So that is really what dictates what is gained and lost from this system. There, the simple explanation of obesity largely ends, and that is the fact that obesity is always caused by energy imbalance, and that is too much energy coming in and not enough being lost. It is as simple as that. The complicated story really starts at this point, because in the middle of these two processes is a great big black box. And it is interactions with this black box that dictate the relative ease with which energy is lost or gained. Now at this point, you might be wondering what's in that black box. Well, it turns out there is a lot of stuff here. There are genetic factors, there are biological factors within the system, behavioural traits, and also there is the effect of the environment. And all of these interact in complicated ways. And so actually it makes the story of energy gain and energy loss very difficult. And often when you try to change one little thing within this system, unpredictable effects occur. I've been researching obesity for almost 20 years, and there's one thing I've learnt in this time. There are no simple solutions to this problem. So here's a useful rule for you. If anyone tries to tell you they have a simple answer to obesity in people or in pets, the chances are it means one of three things. Number one, either they're lying. Number two, they may be stupid. Or number three, they may be trying to sell you something. Often that's a new lifestyle or a new book that they have just written. The truth of the matter is there is great complexity within the pathogenesis of obesity. If you want to see for yourself how complex we understand this truly to be, this next slide shows the current understanding of human obesity pathogenesis. So this is evidence-based, it's based on scientific studies, and it really shows how complicated the story really is. In the middle here, this is our energy balance, energy in, energy out. But look around the edge and what you can see are multiple factors all interacting with one another. The truth of the matter is that obesity in dogs and cats and other species is likely to be equally complex. So before we move on, just a little bit more about some of those particular factors that affect the relative ease of gain or loss of energy. We understand about genetic factors. I'll say some more about that, but that is both genes of the patient and also the genetics of the gut microbiome, the bacteria that live within our intestines. This is a complex environment, and again, genetic factors are important here. Secondly, there are various biological influences. So for example, in cats and dogs, we know that things like age, sex, neuter status, and breed all influence the likelihood of developing obesity. Added to that, there are various metabolic and other processes in the body, such as energy metabolism, insulin sensitivity, again, all of which play their part. Third, there are behavioural factors. And we must remember as vets, we're always dealing with two patients. We have the animal, but we also have the owner. And behaviour of both of those patients is important. Food-related behaviours, activity, and of course influences of friends and family. And then finally, there is the lived-in environment, availability of food, the living space, and the family unit. Let's make no mistake, this is a complex disease to understand. Now, I just want to focus on a couple of the latest bits of the story, really just to show you where our understanding is moving. And firstly, I want to tackle the issue of genetics. This was one of the newspaper articles that came out in the United Kingdom when they discovered the first gene associated with obesity in people. This was the FTO gene. And of course, newspapers like to feel that we've got a solution. So they felt they had the cure already. Sadly, it didn't turn out that way. Since that time, over 50 different genes have been identified that have an effect on obesity. Each of these genes has only a tiny effect, maybe a kilogram or 2 kilograms of effect on body weight. But together, combinations of genes really mean that the effect of genetics is profound. And we understand at the moment that somewhere between 40 and possibly in excess of 80% of a person's risk of developing obesity is determined by their genes. So genetics is a massive part of the story. Now, many, if not most of these genes act within the brain. And what they do is they affect appetite, making people with obesity, on average, hungrier than everybody else. And scientists have coined the term the hungry brain to explain what they mean. It's the fact that your genes make you slightly hungrier. And that also explains why it's very, very difficult to stay on a diet long term. Your genes are fighting against the progress you make. We understand far less about obesity in dogs and cats on a genetic basis, but in 2016, a group in Cambridge discovered the first gene associated with obesity in dogs. This was a gene seen in Labrador retrievers, and it was called pro-opiomelanocortin, or POMC. Now this gene, guess what it does? Yes, you've guessed it. It affects appetite. So the likelihood is that this hungry brain story fits with our dogs and cats as well. Now, we understand that there must be a part played by genetics, also by looking at different breeds. So this figure here shows you the prevalence of overweight. That's in black here, the columns in black, and obesity, and that's the columns in grey, in various breeds of dog. Don't worry too much about the breeds of dog, but what you can see is the prevalence differs in the different breeds. And again, that's likely to be the genetics playing a part. Crucially, however, there's not a single breed where the prevalence of obesity is 0. If I ask you to try to think of a breed that never gets obesity, the chances are you might say something like the greyhound, because they're skinny dogs. Well, here's a greyhound, and yes, it's a greyhound with obesity. This was one that did run round the track, so was a racing greyhound, but then was retired and went to live in a family environment, and sure enough, gained weight. So the reality is, whilst genetics is a big part of the puzzle, it isn't the only part of the story. There's something else out there which is increasing the likelihood of us gaining weight, and it's in fact the environment. So our current understanding of obesity pathogenesis is that we have susceptible genes, lots of them, and we have what we call an obesogenic environment, an environment that makes it more easy for us to gain weight, to develop obesity. And it's the combination of those two things, the genetics and the environment, that leads to obesity. A little bit more about the interplay between genetics and environment now, because we actually understand that obesity is a family concern. It's rarely just experienced by one patient, it is often experienced by a family. For example, we know that children that are born to parents that have obesity are likely to develop obesity themselves. There are also studies in the veterinary field that show that owners that are overweight are likely to have overweight dogs. Now, in the first case, parent and child, it's likely that genetics plays a large part. We would hope genetics has no effect between owner and pet, although as an aside, there's some evidence that people do in fact look like their pets. The reality is that what we have is this family unit, and we have children, parents, pets, and owners all involved in that same family environment. And people have coined the phrase the family food environment to highlight those interactions. So as a child, you are exposed to experiences of food through the eyes of your parents. Most pet owners see their pets as another child, another member of the family. So it's perhaps not surprising that those same environmental influences are shared with our pets. Now, a final part of the story I want to talk about when we're talking about the cause of obesity is the effect of food. And this is a great way to highlight what I told you earlier, that there are no simple answers to the cause of obesity and indeed to solving obesity. Historically, you may remember, if you're as old as I am, that we used to be told that fat, and particularly saturated fat, was the cause of obesity. And of course, because we wanted simple solutions, we were also told that if we restricted fat, then obesity would be solved. I think history has shown us what really happened here. Despite health messages to restrict fat and eat carbohydrate instead, the prevalence of obesity climbed dramatically. So clearly fat was not the only part of the story. We also know that many people who have obesity can be successful in losing weight with low carbohydrate diets, which are often quite high in fat. So again, that tends to tell us that fat was not the cause. Now, if you're exposed to the media like I am at the moment, you will know that the health message recently has changed. No longer are people telling you to restrict fat. Instead, they're telling you to restrict sugar and carbohydrates. So it's now the message that it's these that are to blame for obesity. Because this is now a simple cause and the new simple cause, our simple solution, eat less sugar, and again, obesity will be solved. Now, it's still early days to know whether this will truly make a difference, but we do have some evidence from certain parts of the world. For example, in Australia, availability of sugar per person has been going down over the last 20 to 30 years, but despite that, their prevalence of obesity is increasing. Added to that, in the United States, which has one of the highest rates of obesity in the world, people have actually been eating less sugar for the last 20 years. Despite that, obesity rates continue to climb. So I think this illustrates that the cause of obesity is neither fat nor sugar. As I showed you earlier, it is far more complicated than that. Now, I just want to highlight something which might be a little bit confusing for you at the moment. On the face of it, I've told you that people have been eating less fat and they've been eating less sugar and carbohydrate, yet obesity is getting worse. And that might not seem to make sense, because surely if we're eating less of things, obesity should be going down, shouldn't it? Well, the truth of the matter is that if you actually look at what people have actually consumed in calories over this time, there's a different story. And this is shown on the slide here. So what we have are calories. Red are carbohydrate, blue is fat, and green is protein over the years. Now, this black line here is the time when the message to eat less fat occurred and to eat carbohydrate instead. And here, this second line is where we've been told to eat less sugar. What you can actually see that happened was that indeed, after being told to eat carbohydrate and not fat, people ate more carbohydrate, the red line went up, but they didn't in fact restrict their fat. So people were consuming more calories overall. And even in the last 20 years where people have been eating less sugar, we're still eating far more calories than we were historically. And added to that, there have been other changes in our lifestyle. So if you just focus on the yellow trend here, this is activity, energy expenditure at work over the years. And we're seeing we're less and less active during our daily lives. So we seem to have what we call a perfect storm, where we've been consuming more calories of various forms at the same time as expending less. So just to summarize this first part, if we ask that question, what causes obesity, underlying it all is a simple answer. Remember, it's related to conservation of energy, and obesity always occurs when there is a positive energy balance. However, I hope I've explained for you that the real answer is far more complicated. Remember that black box, and remember all those many factors that contribute to the story. So in this second part, we want to now look at what the consequences of obesity are, what makes it one of the most important medical concerns of our time. Now, this first graphic is again very complicated, but this shows us the pathogenesis of the associated diseases that we see alongside obesity, how obesity causes other illnesses. And what you can actually see here are that there are many factors involved in this inner circle here. And in the outer circle, there are a number of conditions that we tend to see. So within this, let's just break it down. We have some metabolic factors and chemical factors. So we have things that the adipose tissue cells produce, such as adipokines and inflammatory factors. And that leads to things like insulin resistance and effects on blood pressure. We also have more physical or mechanical factors. So with weight gain and obesity, you have an increased body mass, and that can be a greater burden, particularly on the musculoskeletal system. Also, fat can be deposited in different parts of the body, and it can affect the function of those parts. So together, what we tend to see are various metabolic effects, things like diabetes mellitus and increased blood pressure. That is part of the metabolic syndrome. We also see cardiorespiratory disease, increased risk of heart attacks, but also breathing problems such as sleep apnea. I'll say a little bit more about that later. We have musculoskeletal disease, and we have increased risk of neoplasia, certain types of cancer. So all of these really present major health concerns, but let's not forget that final one that I told you about right at the start. Remember the way that society as a whole views obesity. It is a highly stigmatized condition. And in fact, it's very visible, so it's very easy for people with obesity to stand out. Some people might suggest that if you stigmatize somebody, you shame them for being overweight, then maybe that will be an incentive for them to lose weight. The reality from the evidence we have is that the opposite occurs. It actually impairs their ability to lose weight. They're less successful. And added to that, the stigma causes psychological problems that themselves are harmful. So all in all, obesity leads to multiple other effects. And the sum total of these effects is that on average, people with obesity die sooner than those that don't have obesity. And this is illustrated in this slide here. What we have here on the x-axis of this graph is body mass index, and here this is relative risk of death. And as body mass index increases from 25, 30 and beyond, the risk of death and dying, therefore your life is increased and your lifespan is therefore shorter. So that's people. What evidence is there, however, that the same is true in pets? Do we have evidence of effects on lifespan and risk of other disease in our pet species? Well, the simple answer is yes, we do. Let's consider lifespan first and foremost. This is a classic study that was done a number of years ago now, and it's best understood as the lifelong feeding study. What this group of researchers did was they looked at a colony of Labrador Retriever dogs. Half of those dogs they fed ad libitum, the other half they restricted food intake, and that was to about 75% of ad libitum feeding. And what they did then was follow these dogs for life. So it took about 15 to 20 years. Now, the dogs that were ad libitum fed tended to be overweight. Their body condition score was somewhere close to 7 out of 9. So not dramatically obese, but overweight. On the other hand, those that were restricted tended to be in a more optimal body fat mass, and their body condition score was somewhere between 4 and 5 out of 9. The most profound finding of all from this study was that this difference in feeding and body condition was associated with an almost 2-year difference in lifespan. Put another way, dogs that overeat and are overweight are likely to live a shorter life. Now, the downside, of course, of this study is that it was done in a colony, and it would be questionable as to whether that would reflect what happens with pet dogs living amongst us, and dogs, of course, in other breeds. Recently, with a number of colleagues, we've actually been able to look at lifespan in a large population of dogs living across North America. We were able to study over 50,000 pet dogs, and we looked at 12 of the most popular breeds. We compared dogs that were overweight with those in a more normal weight. And what we found was that for every single breed, there was a net shortening of lifespan when dogs were overweight. And this was something from about 6 months or so in the German Shepherd dog to over 2 years in some of the smaller dogs like Yorkshire Terriers. Either way, these are considerable periods of life that is being affected as a result of obesity. So we have evidence of lifespan effects. We also have evidence, like in people, that there are multiple diseases associated with obesity, and various epidemiological studies have shown this. Here is a list of a number of them, and I'm sad I don't have enough time to talk about them all, but as you can see, there are increased risks of orthopedic disease, diabetes, pancreatitis, respiratory disease, so on and so forth. So a lot of disease associations. In the interest of time, I'm just going to focus on a couple for us now. So let's do this by looking at a case. This is George. As you can see, he's a 6-year neutered male Labrador Retriever. He was in obese body condition, and he was referred to our hospital at the University of Liverpool, not actually because of his obesity, but because he had severe osteoarthritis. I don't think you need to be a vet to see how badly affected his joints are. And he needed hip and elbow replacements. So this one case highlights the fact that a very common disease association in dogs with obesity is orthopedic disease. And in fact, about 2/3 of dogs that we see at our specialist weight management clinic at Liverpool have orthopedic disease as well. Now, it's important to understand that cats get orthopedic disease too. The trouble is, both owners and vets find it very difficult to spot. This is a great study that highlights that very point. So what the author of this study did was he reviewed radiographs taken from cats for reasons other than lameness. Often they were not taken deliberately to show the limbs and the joints, but when a joint was included within the radiographic field, he scored it for arthritis. What he found was that just over 20% of all cat joints had evidence of arthritis, yet neither their owners nor their vets were aware. So arthritis is a significant concern. Why am I telling you this in an obesity talk? Well, we have other studies that show that there's an association between body condition score and musculoskeletal disease. So in this recent study from Australia, we know that as body condition score increases between 5 and 9 out of 9, the risk of developing a musculoskeletal condition increases 4-fold. So a cat at body condition score 9 is over 4 times more likely to suffer from musculoskeletal disease than a cat at body condition score 5. The second body system I want to cover is the respiratory system, and this is a big issue in people. Many people who have obesity suffer from a condition called sleep apnea. It's a condition where they never properly go to sleep, and this is because as they start drifting off to sleep, they start to suffocate. The body fat around their chest and their pharynx and their neck constricts their breathing to a point where they can't properly sleep. And over time, that has a significant impact on health and can lead to things like heart failure. So much so that many patients need to wear one of these respirators simply to be able to sleep properly. And I think just seeing these two radiographs highlights that very issue. So if you compare the patient in ideal weight and their lung capacity with that of a patient with obesity, you can see that that respiratory reserve is severely compromised. Dogs and cats can get respiratory disease as well associated with obesity, such as Rap here, who, as you can see, is a 7-year neutered male Jack Russell Terrier. He was another patient that presented to the University of Liverpool, but this time he presented for a chronic cough, and after investigations we found that he had tracheal collapse. If you look at the first part of his thoracic trachea, you can see that it is narrowed compared with other parts. Now, this is a disease that can be treated surgically or with a stent, but obesity is a major factor involved, and of course, tackling the obesity can sometimes be the major solution. So we've talked about lifespan effects. We've talked about disease risk effects. Now, there are other widespread effects that we see. And one of the things we should not underestimate is the financial burden that obesity costs to people and their pets. And in this study, it was estimated that owners with pets that had obesity on average paid 15 to 35% more for the annual health care of their pet than an owner who had a pet at ideal weight. So there is a considerable financial burden, and for me, another reason we should consider acting in one of what I think is the most important medical conditions of our time. So we've talked about the causes of obesity. We've talked about the consequences of obesity. What I want to do now is just finish up by looking at what we as veterinary professionals can start to do to make a difference. I want to highlight for you the benefits that can actually happen through successful weight loss. Remember from what I've told you, we have effects on lifespan. We have various diseases that are associated with obesity. And we have impaired bodily function. So these are all the major consequences we see. So through successful weight loss, we could hypothesize that perhaps dogs and cats might live longer. Perhaps we may be able to prevent some of those diseases if we get in quickly enough. And of course, perhaps we can improve function overall of their body as a whole. In this scientific study by Marshall and co-workers, they looked at dogs that had obesity and also had osteoarthritis. And what they found was that successful weight loss, just 6 to 9% weight loss, improved mobility. And to prove that, they used a force plate, so they were actually measuring mobility objectively. You can see this more subjectively in these two videos. This is a video or two videos of a patient at the University of Liverpool before and after weight loss. And you can see for yourself the difference in mobility that that weight loss has brought. Not only is the dog walking quicker, but note tail carriage, head carriage. We're dealing with a much happier as well as healthier dog. So perhaps for me, one of the most profound benefits is functional improvement. And for those dogs that have lameness or have mobility issues, this is really one of the ones we can strive for. And note too that you don't need a lot of weight loss to bring those benefits. Do you remember I told you about Rap? That was the dog presenting with the chronic cough, who also had tracheal collapse. This is him before weight loss. This is him after weight loss. I promise you it's the same dog. He lost 41% body weight. And actually, as a consequence of that weight loss, his chronic cough disappeared. So not only did he feel a lot better, but all his clinical signs resolved. At the University of Liverpool, we have a technique called DEXA, which actually shows us body fat mass. And we get these lovely images of the dog before weight loss and after weight loss. I just want you to focus on the middle of the body here. In the middle, we've got the chest and the heart. And what you can actually see after weight loss, the lung capacity, which is around the heart, the black part of that little triangle, is far larger. So that again highlights the benefits on things like respiratory capacity. Finally, we've talked about health issues and lifespan issues, but overall, we know that obesity leads to a poorer quality of life. And this was demonstrated in a study that we performed back in 2012. What we did here was team up with scientists at the University of Glasgow who had developed a validated questionnaire looking at quality of life in dogs. Now, this was a questionnaire for those people who like filling in surveys. That is because it was almost 20 pages long and contained over 100 questions. So you really needed to like to fill in these surveys. Now, crucially, although we were asking over 100 questions, we were actually only asking about 4 things over and over again. And we were giving owners descriptions to see whether they fitted their dog. And owners could agree or disagree with that description. Let me illustrate. This page has various terms looking at activity. And you can see if you read down the different terms that are used. Things like active, apathetic, energetic, lackluster, lethargic. So some of those are positive activity terms, some of them are negative, and the owners agree or disagree with each. And the beauty of this system is that the questionnaire internally validates the answers. So overall, we're able to look at 4 quality of life factors. Vitality, that's mobility and activity, and of course higher scores are best here. Emotional disturbance and anxiety, these are psychological factors and lower scores are better. And finally, the questionnaire could also produce evidence of chronic pain, and again lower scores are better. What did we find? Well, not surprisingly, quality of life was worse in obese dogs compared with dogs in ideal weight. The good news was that it improved successfully with weight loss, and that was for 3 out of 4 of the factors. That's illustrated here. So you can see for each of our 4 factors, we've got pre and post weight loss results. We see improvements in vitality, decreases in emotional disturbances, and decreases in chronic pain. So I think that is a pretty good result. I could spend a lot longer telling you about some more of the findings, but in many respects, pictures tell 1,000 words. And this is just one of those dogs on the study before and after weight loss. And I think the posture of this dog tells you everything you need to know about the fact that the dog has better quality of life. So, thank you for listening. I just want to summarize the key points of what I've told you. Firstly, if you remember, we talked about what causes obesity, and I told you that there was a simple explanation, which is true. It's all related to energy imbalance. However, below that simple explanation, we realize that the story is far more complex. There's a big part played by genetics, as well as biology, the environment, and behavior. Next, we talked about the consequences of obesity. And to summarize, dogs and cats with obesity are likely to live a shorter life. It's likely to be more miserable because they'll have a poorer quality of life. It's likely to be more expensive for their owners, and they're likely to have other associated diseases. And finally, remember that weight loss predominantly will improve function and quality of life in our patients, and these are the ones that we need to promote in our weight loss programs. The good news here is small bits of weight loss can make a big, big difference. Thank you.